Welcome to the Oscar Lodge Kitchen as we begin the process of baking and cooking for Christmas. And so tonight, what we're going to start is step number 1 of the annual fruitcake. Christmas is coming, and so typically I like to do my fruitcakes about 6 to 8 weeks before Christmas to allow them to properly age before I hand them out as gifts or I serve them to my guests here at Oscar Lodge. So what we're going to start in step number 1, we're going to mix our fruit. We're going to steep it in some brandy this evening. So basically I have a cup of chopped dates. I have 16 ounces of glassy cherries, and I typically use the red and the green ones. I have a cup of currants. I have 2 cups of raisins. So you've seen, I kind of mix them. I have the golden raisins on the top, and I have the sultanas on the bottom. So I like to just mix them up for color purposes. But if you can only get one kind of raisin, it's not the end of the world either. And then I have 8 ounces of mixed peel. So I've mixed this up as well. In my shop, I have the 2 kinds of mixed peel. So I kind of mix them up. The first one is more the citrus and the orange one, and the other one is mixed fruit. So it's always nice to have that bit of color when you're making your fruit cakes as well. I like to have that color. And of course, optionally, you can use a cup of chopped walnuts. I tend to multiply this recipe 3 or 4 times each year, and so I put nuts in some of my cakes, but then in other cakes I don't, because some people have difficulty digesting nuts or allergic or what have you, and so I typically just use nuts in some of the cakes and not all of them. So here's what you have so far. So you'll have all of these different ingredients all mixed together. And so what we're going to do now, we're going to pour a half a cup or so of brandy on top, and we're going to let them steep for a day, 2, maybe 3 days. And then we're going to do the baking of the cakes. And of course, that will be step number 2. So right now, tonight, we're going to put half a cup of brandy. So you might want to have a little sniffer of brandy nearby just to give it a little taste to see how it is. Excellent. And so we're going to let it steep in brandy. And so just going to give it a very, very good mix up. And then you might want to, over the next day or 2, before you start the baking, just mix it through again to keep the brandy throughout the different fruits, and so it will infuse all of your fruit. All right, and so that's step 1. And so we're going to take this and we're going to cover it with some saran wrap, and we're going to leave it out on the counter and let it steep for about a day, maybe 2 days, 3 days, depending on your schedule. And then we'll come back and do step number 2. Welcome to stage 2 of our fruitcake making process, and today we're going to be making the batter. If you look into my bowl over here, actually you'll see that the candied and dried fruits and the walnuts that we put in the bowl with some brandy the other night have now plumped up. They smell terrific, and so we're going to make the batter and then we'll bake the cakes. So to do that, we're going to take 2 cups of flour, a half teaspoon of salt, and a teaspoon of baking powder, and we're going to put them through a sieve. I always like to put my flour in a sieve and sift it. I find to take out any of the impurities, and sometimes you do get little sticky things in the bottom of it, and so yes, we did. And so I'm going to just take this away now, and we'll put this aside, and then we'll start, actually we're going to add to that, we're going to add our spices. So in the spice section, we have a teaspoon of allspice, a teaspoon of cinnamon, and a teaspoon of dried cloves. So we'll put that together and we'll mix it up into the, I probably should have sifted it along with the other dried ingredients, but these are things that happen. And so it doesn't really make any difference as long as we mix them up well, and they are mixed well. So while we're at it, why don't we dredge the fruit in a half a cup of flour. So dredging means we're basically going to coat them with flour so that when they're put into the batter, they're not going to all clump up and form a ball and go to the bottom of your pans. So we'll have our fruit evenly distributed, and it takes about a half a cup of flour to dredge them. So basically your rich looking fruit is going to be now a little bit covered in flour so that they won't stick together when we put them into the rest of the ingredients. So again, we'll put that aside, and now we'll take and mix up our eggs and our sugar and our butters. So in this recipe, and don't worry, the recipe is going to be below the video, so you'll see the complete recipe, so you won't have to take these measurements down. I just want to mention that this is a recipe that belonged to my great-grandmother, Mary Jane. And this recipe was given to me actually by a second cousin of mine, my mother's cousin. I don't remember my great-grandmother making the fruit cake, but my cousin Donna does remember that. And one of the things that my great-grandmother was famous for was making wedding cakes. And it could very well be that this was actually the recipe that she used to make wedding cakes. My great-grandmother used to make them with my grandmother and my great-grandmother's niece, and they would make lots of wedding cakes, even the wedding cake of my parents as well. So in those days, traditional wedding cakes had fruit cakes. So at least one layer of the wedding cake was always fruit cake, and so my great-grandmother always made that. And it could very well be that she didn't serve these at Christmas, but served them as part of a wedding cake, because I don't remember having tasted her fruitcakes at Christmas time. But it could be that I'm much younger than some of my cousins as well, even though we did go to visit my great-grandparents every Sunday that I can remember in my childhood, and those were fond memories. But my grandmother did make fruitcakes, I remember that very well. Could very well be the same recipe, but my grandmother never wrote recipes down because they were all in her head, and she went by feel and taste and smell and look, and so she would know if they had the right ingredients, the right proportions, and what have you. So those were the skills of a true baker and a true cook. And of course, I come from a very long line, especially on my mother's side, of very good cooks. My great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, my sister as well, and myself. We all, my sister and I, both like to dabble in cooking and baking and things like that. So it's a passion. So this is a recipe that belongs to my family, and so that's why I'm sharing it with you. It's not just any generic recipe that you get off the internet. While they could be good, they could be the recipes of very experienced cooks and bakers, but this one is extra special because it belongs to my family. And so I share that with you today. And so right now we're going to take a cup of butter. So I've cut it up, I've let it sit out for a while so that it will warm to room temperature, and I've cut it into little squares, but it is a cup of butter. And I'm just going to beat that with my KitchenAid. right now before I add into that my 6 eggs and 2 cups of brown sugar. And then to that we're going to add some molasses and some apple juice as well. Put it up a little bit. And what I like to do with this recipe and other recipes, once you get the actual foundational recipe down pat, you can add variations. So what I like to do though is respect the proportions between the fruit, the batter, and the fat. But you know, in terms of raisins, currants, and the different kinds, candied fruits and what have you, I like to vary it a bit. And sometimes instead of molasses, I'll add treacle. You know, instead of traditional brown sugar, I might add some muscovado sugar or some demerara sugar, which are both variations of brown sugar. Some are in their purest forms, the unrefined stuff as well. And of course, so in terms of the fruit as well, sometimes I don't use glassy cherries. I find glassy cherries a little garish at times because they're so bright and they look so artificial. And so I like sometimes to use more traditional looking cherries, dried cherries and things like that. I also like to add different kinds of mixed peel, the citrus especially, and so I make variations on this original recipe. So now the butter has been fairly well beaten. So what I'm going to add now, I'm going to add 2 cups of brown sugar. And this is just regular brown sugar. It's not muscovado or demerara sugar. It's just regular brown sugar. And so that's beating now. And then of course we're going to add the eggs little by little. I've already decanted them, broken them, and put them in this little dish as well. So we'll add them not necessarily one by one, but a couple at a time so that they get a chance to be beaten into the actual mixture. So, oops, I actually put 4 in this time, so we'll have to make sure that they're well beaten up before I add any more. These KitchenAid mixers are actually the best thing since sliced bread, and that is so true. If you don't have one, I highly, highly, highly recommend it. We'll add our last ones. And you might see on the counter a few little flowers and pumpkins. And normally these cakes, as I said in the last segment, are made early before Christmas so that by Christmas time they've aged and they're ripe and mature and they're ready to be eaten with all the fullness of their flavors. So I tend to make mine 6 to 8 weeks before Christmas, in early October most of the time. I'll just take a spoon now. Get all the sugar scraped off the sides with the butter. So mix this up wonderfully. Here we go again. Going to add 3/4 of a cup of molasses. And as I said earlier, you could also use treacle as well. It's not as sweet as molasses, actually. You often get it in British food stores. Um, and also with regard to the actual the dried fruits that you use, older recipes didn't necessarily have the same ingredients that we get today, or they had different ingredients as well, or they just used what they had. Because my grandparents, my family grew up in the Magdalen Islands, so far from an urban center, so they may not have had access to all the ingredients that are in the actual recipe at all times. So, and they make do with what they have, and that's what I do when I am making it as well. I use variations of the same recipe. And try to respect the proportions always. And so this was a 1/4 cup of apple juice that I add as well. And so to that, I'm going to start adding my flour. And you have to do this gently and mix it in, because if you don't, flour will go flying everywhere. I've had that happen. That's why I know that. And so let's do it bit by bit as we add it in. The wonderful smells of the allspice, the cinnamon, and the cloves actually are very, very aromatic and beautiful. And once they start baking, you'll smell the fullness of these smells, and your house will smell wonderful for the time it takes to bake them. So what you should have done already, and I may not have already told you this, is turn on your oven and have your oven preheated to 275 degrees Fahrenheit. Because the cakes take almost 2 hours to bake at 275. So what you should have done also at the beginning, and I neglected to tell you this, is to prepare, I normally put these in 3 loaf pans. And the loaf pans need to be greased and add parchment as well. Parchment paper, so that so let's turn on the mixer. And the parchment paper will keep them from sticking and make them able to be removed very easily without having them stick or what have you in your pans. So what I tend to do is to fill the pans 3/4 full, so that to leave room that they might rise a bit. Now this recipe doesn't rise a whole lot. There's only a teaspoon of baking soda in it as a rising agent. So bear that in mind. It's not going to rise a whole lot, but don't overfill your pans either. So I think this is pretty much done in terms of batter. So I'm just going to move this aside. Take the paddle off, and we're going to mix it all together. I'm going to actually pour this into the larger bowl with the fruit, because that is a larger bowl for mixing, and we're going to bring it all together, and then we're going to put it in the pans. So, and it's great to share these old family recipes, and the comfort food, actually, especially when we now, most of us live away from home. So anything that reminds us of our ancestors, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, or even our parents as well, it's always wonderful to share those things, because the art of old-fashioned recipes is disappearing, because a lot of them were complicated in the sense that there were a number of steps. And before the advent of great additions like KitchenAids and things like that, it was a lot of hard work, and you had to beat and mix and source all your ingredients as well. Sometimes it's not always easy to source certain ingredients that you're used to using with these type of cakes. And so as you see, it's pretty thick. There's a lot of fruit in here. So mix it up well. And I'm offering actually this recipe in conjunction with Grandma's Bakery. I don't know how many of you have visited Les Îles de la Madeleine, the Magdalen Islands, but there's a historical museum towards the east end of it, and it's called the Council for Anglophone Magdalen Islanders. And they have a bakery that they call Grandma's Bakery. And Grandma's Bakery makes a lot of traditional recipes from the islands. They make butter and pickles and all kinds of foods. And so today we're making this in conjunction with Grandma's Bakery, and Grandma's Bakery will be offering these fruit cakes for sale actually in the coming weeks as well. They'll be taking orders, not my cakes, but the recipe, and so they'll have somebody else make the cakes. And so I think this is pretty much together. So let's start filling our pans. And now, as I said, we're going to use 3 pans. Now, I should have measured these for you, but I didn't. And so I'm going to measure them and put them in the list of ingredients in the recipe when I share it with you online. So let's evenly distribute all of these. So you see that these are parchment lines, so you don't want to go beyond where the parchment is either. And so I'm just going to put them in here, and then we'll top up as we need to. And as I say, the smell in the kitchen is fabulous right now. It's kind of a messy job as well, and even though I love doing this, I do find it awfully messy. And if you don't like to get your fingers dirty, this may not be the recipe to make. Sometimes I get 4 loaves out of this recipe too. I always say 3, but if you have a smaller pans, you might get 4, or so if you make them less full as well, you might get 4. Don't be surprised if they don't rise a lot. That's not a mistake. That's the way they actually are. So we probably could have gotten 4. I think this is enough. But anyway, I didn't prepare 4 pans. Some years I did and didn't get 4. And this year, I think I could have probably gotten 4. Let's just top up the rest of the pans. And okay. Yumminess. If some of you are on Facebook, I've been watching Facebook of late, and all of my cousins who have the same recipe are all preparing their recipes as well. So that's always nice that we're all using a common recipe, and it reminds us of our great-grandmother. My great-grandmother, some of them, it's their grandmother, and because we're all of various ages, and here we go. I'll eat the bowl later when you don't see me. So here we go. So I'll just put them a little cap so that get all the air bubbles out. Apologies to all of you listening. And so we're going to put these in the oven for 275 degrees for 2 hours. But after an hour and a half, take a toothpick and test them. And so if the toothpick comes out clean like every other cake, they're ready to be taken out. And so don't overcook them. So So 2 hours, but check them after an hour and a half. All right, so we'll see you then for the next step. My cakes have come out of the oven, so you have 3 loaves, and so I'm just going to leave them in the pans for a little while just to cool, and then I'm going to put them on a cake wrap, and then I'll be back to show you what I do next. I'm going to infuse them with a bit of alcohol. So you can choose, I usually use brandy, whiskey, or something like that. Some people use rum, some people use vodka, some people even use sherry and other things like that as well. So I leave that up to you. So these are what the cakes look like, and so I'm going to let them cool, and we'll be back for another step after that. So now we have let our cakes cool on a rack for a couple of hours. We're going to give them their first feeding with brandy. I'm using brandy on these 3 cakes, so it doesn't take a lot. And so we're going to monitor these cakes over the next couple of weeks. So just pour it on gently and feed them. And then we're going to wrap them in a bit of cheesecloth. So just maybe a couple of tablespoons each one right now. Try to get them a little even. So at first they're very greedy for liquid, and they'll absorb it all. And then we'll wrap them in cheesecloth and then check them in a few days to see if they can take some more. And you'll notice when they've had enough and then you just let them age for a couple of months, 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, in a sealed plastic or airtight container, and wrap them in cheesecloth. So the cheesecloth will also absorb some of the alcohol as well, and so it will keep them nice and moist. But you don't want them to be too moist either. You want them to don't want them to have too much alcohol, or else people might get a little tipsy having a piece of your fruit cake. So I think that's what we're going to put in them for now. And now we're going to wrap each one in some cheesecloth. I've already cut the cheesecloth, so we're just going to wrap them in, like this, and then wrap them around. Not too complicated. Each one will have their own little piece. And so here it is, the other cake. And then we're going to put them in a airtight container. And as I said, check on them the first couple of weeks, about every 3 or 4 days, to see where they are and if they need some more brandy, and then you'll be able to gauge it from there. After about a couple of weeks, they should probably stop drinking the brandy. They'll be less greedy for the actual brandy. So we can fit 3 cakes in here. And so that's it. So this is the next step. And so we'll put that away and then come back in a couple of weeks for the next step. Hello, we're at the stage now where we're going to be decorating, or actually preparing our Christmas cakes to be given out to friends and neighbors and whomever you wish to share them with. So I've prepared 3 already. So it's another multi-stage process. And so what you're going to do, you're going to take some apricot jam, heat it up, and while you're heating it up, you might want to take some marzipan and roll it out and cut it to the size of your Christmas cakes. And it's going to be the top layers. So basically what you're going to do, you're going to take the heated apricot jam, you're going to rub it on top of your cake, and then you're going to put a layer of marzipan, and then of course Then in a day or so after the marzipan has dried a bit, so you're going to keep it uncovered, just cover it with a tea towel or something. And then you're going to put the royal icing on top and prepare it for the little boxes that you're going to send it out in. So this is the next step. And so we have 14 cakes to do. So I'm going to get back to work. So that's what you're going to do. And the royal icing is going to go on top of the layer of marzipan, because marzipan, if it doesn't dry, the oils in the marzipan will come through in your royal icing, and you really don't want that. Here we are. We've just iced another 3 of our fruit cakes with royal icing. Royal icing is a mixture of egg whites, icing sugar, and a bit of lemon or vanilla extract. So you just add it and then you mix it up with a mixer and then just ice it onto the cakes. So basically the cakes have already been prepared. They have, if you remember the last segment, I warmed up some apricot jam, brushed them, and then I added some almond paste on top of that, and now I let the almond paste dry, and then, or marzipan as we call it, and I also put the royal icing on. So I'm just waiting for that to dry, and then we're going to start packaging them in their little tins, and we're going to decorate them prettily. And so you wrap them in a bit of this cheese paper, and then I'm just going to wrap them in a little colorful doilies. So here's what they look like. So voila, this is fruitcake, and they're all ready now to be sent out to your friends and neighbors, whomever you wish to give a little Christmas fruitcake to. Now, as I said, this was the recipe that belonged to my great-grandmother, and Mary Jane Bell Keating, and she often made cakes for weddings as well. So I have a big one that's downstairs that I haven't iced yet. And I'm waiting for a special occasion because it's an 8-inch round cake. So maybe, who knows, there might be a wedding in somebody's future. And so maybe I'll make them a wedding cake, or a layer of, because traditional wedding cake often consisted of a layer of fruitcake. So anybody who's getting married, let me know, and I might have a layer of cake to give you. And so that's that. And so enjoy your Christmas cakes. I'm going to be starting distribution of mine this week. So we'll see you for Christmas. And so again, thank you for joining me for these videos. It's been a pleasure sharing with you some of my family recipes and some of my own recipes that I've developed since I've moved to my house. And so these are my recipes that I use at Christmas time. And the last of the series will be making meat pies. And so that will take place in the next couple of weeks. So take care.